Should we?
All right, welcome to Gateway API meeting for October 9th, 2023. Thanks to everyone for attending. This is a Kubernetes community meeting, which means we abide by all the same code of conduct and everything else that other Kubernetes meetings do. At a very high level, that just means please be nice to each other. We really appreciate that. And also, while we have an extra minute or two, sometimes when we see new names or names that may not have been here for a while, we give an opportunity for people to introduce themselves and say what interests them in Gateway API or why they might be attending today's meeting. So if anyone wants to give a quick intro, we've got a minute or two for that as we're getting started.
Yeah, I can give a quick intro. Sorry, it's on my dinner time too. I'm going to turn off the camera the rest of time if that's okay. Yeah, so my name is Lin Sun. Some of you probably already know me from the Gamma meetings. I had participating early this year. So we're super interested in implementing Gateway API in our product and also our open source product, Glue Edge. Certainly, you guys probably also know me from Istio. Istio already have implemented the Gateway API. So yeah, super interested in what's going on in this space. Hopefully, I'll be able to contribute and help out. Thanks, Rob.
Awesome, welcome. Cool. Anybody else?
Yeah. Hey, this is Ian Rudy. I'm also with Solo. I work with Lynn, and I'm here for the same reasons. Prior to working at Solo, I was also very interested in the Gateway API and ended up spending a bit of time going down a rabbit hole, implementing our own sort of solution for this early on. But this community solution looks much better. So very excited for it.
I think my connection must have gone crazy.
Yeah, I think it might have been yours because I heard him just fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Really cool
sorry.
to see new people. Thank you both
Yeah.
for saying hi.
Yeah, sorry, my internet must have cut out temporarily, but great to meet you as well. Welcome. Yeah, thanks again for intros, and great to have new people here. Let me shift gears into a logo poll. This was from the last meeting. We were looking for a new Gateway API logo. We believe we found it. So these are the results for anyone curious. The winner appears to be option B by a pretty good margin here. The runner-up was option A. But thank you to everyone who voted. I think the results are fairly clear here. So yeah, thank you to everyone. And I'm looking forward to actually using this logo in a few more places. And maybe if we get lucky, we'll have something. I don't know what in time for KubeCon. We'll see.
Something. We should be able to have something by KubeCon.
Definitely anyone who has ideas, who has I'm pretty new to all of this, but anyone who's got some experience getting these things together, definitely let us know if you have ideas.
To be clear, like we're talking about physical merch or something like that.
Yes. I mean, whatever you can imagine, but yes, that's the goal. And then last up here, let me actually, before I forget, if you are going to KubeCon, I highly encourage you to run through and register for the Contributor Summit. It's something that you don't get signed up for by default, but it's something that I have found to be the most valuable part of my time at KubeCon usually. I get to meet lots of other contributors and often good representation from Gateway API there. So yes, if you are able to make it, we'd love to see you there. Okay, I think that's everything. Let me hop right into this review and we can go from here. I think we're still actually waiting on people, but that's all right. We'll just kick it off anyways. All right. No, I probably don't want
I should probably note that once we actually do have Tim and any of the other API reviewers present, then I hate to be the Johnny McNo feedback, but it's going to be hard for us to get through this thing. With experience says it's going to be hard for us to get through this with Tim and the other API reviewers in time, even if it's just the maintainers and them. So feedback is very welcome, but if you could hold it to the chat, I would very much appreciate it, because the last couple of times we've done this, we have not got through the entire deck very, very easily at all. So yeah, watch and comment, please, and we'll try and hit the comments when we can.
On that note, Nick, I'm going to try to keep notes like I did last time round, but I actually have a hard stop this time in 50 minutes, so don't be alarmed if I suddenly vanish.
No problem. Thanks.
Makes sense. Yeah, and I think this time we will try and do a hard stop at, to honor everyone's time at the hour. So we'll see what we can get through. There is a lot here, more than I realized, that we've gotten in the past
Shocking.
basically 2 months. So thank you, everyone. This was like everything with Gateway API, it takes all of us. It is not any one person or small group of people. I think just about everything on this list had multiple contributors. But yeah, let me run through this. So the way we usually walk through these is we'll just provide this kind of high level overview of what we're trying to accomplish in the review and overall process. And then we go through all the changes between our previous release. So that's between 0.8 and 1.0. And there's a significant chunk, considering this is basically 2 months of time between releases. First up is versioning. As we all know, Gateway Class, and HTTP Route are moving to V1, and Beta is going away, not for those resources, but for no additional resources will get a Beta API version. And then as far as key clarifications, we have added this concept of listener isolation and clarified what it means for a parent ref to be unique. Those are both significant updates to spec. And then there's a whole host of new features. One, HTTP route timeouts, backend TLS policy. Policy now has ancestors in their status to allow for multi-tenant policies. And then, which very, very closely related to backend TLS policy. And then gateway infrastructure labels. And this basically means being able to specify labels that you want to set on every piece of infrastructure that is provisioned for a gateway. And then app protocol. That's basically how Gateway API interacts with app protocol, which had been poorly defined up till now. And then we have a couple related projects that other people are working on that have also seen a lot of updates. So yeah, there's a lot in here. Kind of to go against, well, not against, but while we are waiting for Tim and Cal or Cal to show up, if anyone does have comments or questions, you're more than welcome to jump in at any point. But for now, just keep on running through these, and yeah. Okay, so the way we do API review in Gateway API is we will basically do a diff of the APIs directory and put that into a PR. So this is all the changes to that directory from 0.8 until now. That includes all the API types, all the webhook validation, and all the utils, but it intentionally excludes conformance tests, docs changes, and GEPs themselves. We've included any relevant GEPs and links to them in this presentation itself, but trying to review everything is just, it's a lot. So that's where we've come to with this. First up on versioning. Let me take one quick second here and I can't figure out how to, okay. Brief segue. Make sure that we have, nope, still waiting. Okay, sorry. I am losing track of everything. I'm not good at Zoom, I'm sorry. Can anyone see the correct window anymore, or have we lost track
No,
of?
you close. Yeah,
Your
when you
sharing
close
is
the
stopped.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can
sweet.
only see you.
Okay, that's fantastic.
I mean, it's fine that we can see you. That's great.
Let me. Oh man, this is bad. Okay, we'll bring it back together here. Okay, share screen again. Sorry for the technical difficulties. All right, we are getting somewhere. All
Yeah,
right.
it's
You want
good.
to just leave it in this view rather
Yes,
than go.
I think that is a much smarter move than what I was doing. Okay, so next up, API version changes. V1 has been added to gateway class and HP route, which is absolutely identical to V1 beta 1. We're not making any changes between these API versions. They're going to be the same. All updates going forward will apply to both API versions, etc. These are just identical from here on out. They fully meet all the graduation criteria. By my count, we have 7 fully conformant implementations. Thank you, everyone. I know that's taken a lot of work from many of the people on this call. And then the other thing is V1 is not done. V1 is not complete. Additional features will continue to be added in the future via the experimental API channel. So yeah, that's a high level of what's changing here. Then some of you may have missed this, but beta is going away in Gateway API. There's a PR linked to 2446. We're continuing with 2 release channels, standard and experimental, but all new resources will start in the experimental channel, have alpha, and then graduate directly from alpha to GA in the standard channel. So the whole idea here is that, again, there are 2 levels of stability, not 3. There's experimental and there's effectively stable or standard channel. There's not a whole lot of value in that intermediate state. And the few resources that already have beta API versions will continue to have them, but none that don't have them will get, like, no additional resources will get them. Yeah. Any questions so far? I've just kind of been running through this, but if anyone has questions on any of these changes, don't hesitate to jump in here.
Rob, you just said a second ago, I think I heard you saying that the V1 beta 1 resources would continue to be supported for the foreseeable future. Did I hear that correctly? And if so, how far out do you think foreseeable is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it may be forever. I can't commit to that for sure, but I don't personally have any plans to get rid of them. So to be clear, CRDs have API versions, like it's a single CRD. And inside that CRD, you have a list of API versions and the definition within them.
So
it'd still be the same
for
CRD.
a second. I don't think we need to have a detailed discussion about this right now. I was just curious if there was a time frame attached to that, or if you were thinking forever, and you have answered that. So that was the extent of my question for right now.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, forever here means as long as it's practical. There are a couple of other considerations as well, like having the V1 beta 1 structs available, as well as the V1 beta 1 YAML definitions is kind of different. And so, like, we may look to retire the V1 beta 1 structs. Yeah. Hi, Tim.
Yeah.
Looks like we better roll back, Rob.
Yeah, awesome. I think nothing here is going to be surprising, so I'm going to keep on running.
I think maybe
Tim.
just flip back to the flip back to the summary slide so we can show Tim that before we.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Okay, so Tim, we have a ridiculous number of things to cover. So we're gonna try and time box everything as well as we can here. The first up is versioning. We've got everything you'd expect there. I don't think any surprises. Then the API spec clarifications that we'll cover in pretty short order, but then a host of new experimental features that would like to get your feedback on as we go. Yeah, okay. All right, so let me jump right into clarifications in our API spec. And the reason I'm even covering these is these affect our soon-to-be GA resources, and want to make sure that what we're saying here completely lines up and is not surprising to anyone. In the previous versions of the API, we considered parent refs like this to be unique. So you would say one is referencing a parent ref foo with section name bar, and then this is only possible in an experimental channel, but you could also use a port. So you could say gateway listener bar and gateway listener, with 80, which may or may not refer to different things. We're saying that's no longer valid. You either need to always specify section name or always specify port if you're referring to the same parent.
There's a small caveat there, is that the port has to be different.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's yeah, thank you. So yes, exactly that. This only affects experimental channels, so I don't think it's a big deal, but it is a change in our validation for experimental channel.
Tim?
Yeah, next up, listener isolation. This has been a topic that received just a lot of discussion, shall we say. But the idea here is that if you have two listeners, one for a.b.com and another one for star.b.com, if a request matches a.b.com, it should only be routed via the routes that are attached to that listener. If there's no match here, there should be no match. It shouldn't then cascade over to star.b.com. So that this is a recommendation and not a requirement, because there are some implementations that will have trouble supporting this idea right now. We're hoping that everyone can eventually move towards this path. We have a way to describe it. This feature is called listener isolation. We'll have conformance tests for it, but this is just trying to be more specific with how we expect this matching behavior to work.
Yeah.
And we're hoping in time that we will. We're hoping in time that we will get into a state where we can make that a core feature that you don't cascade.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, this is definitely a case where those of us we wrote the API originally, we intended it to be like that, but we never wrote the spec clearly enough to ensure that it was not possible that we said that explicitly enough.
So if I can replay it back just so I can be sure I understand. If a request comes in for a.b.com and there is no route at all, you'd rather serve an error than fall back on the catch-all.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is particularly important for TLS, because our TLS config is attached at the listener level. So you can imagine that you get, say, let's say in the future we add client cert validation or something like at the listener level, which is where all our TLS lives. You'd hate for you to have all the TLS apply for this listener, and then actually I'm going to get routed via this route over here attached to another listener. Or
it makes sense. I just wanted to make sure I understood the semantics.
Yeah. Cool. All right, on to experimental features. The first one is one that came awfully close to getting into 0.8, but we just could not decide on duration formatting, and so it missed the boat. We've spent a bunch of time talking about duration formatting. Thank you to everyone involved. I think, Flynn, you really pushed that one forward. But I think We have consensus here. The duration format we settled on is described by this regex here for anyone who's very curious, but it's basically a subset of Golang duration formatting, and I think Open API. So there's another format that it's a subset of as well. And again, just trying to make this as straightforward as possible. There are two kinds of timeouts. There's a request timeout, which is the overall duration of a request. And then there's a backend request, which is particularly relevant if, for example, you're doing retries and you might have more requests, multiple requests between a gateway and a backend. Yeah, but these are at the HTTP route rule level.
Anyway.
What's that?
As soon as retries come along, anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, so is this covered? Is this covered in the GA API?
So to clarify, everything from here and below is
okay, got it.
Experimental only. So it is going to be something that you can access like this, with V1. But the key thing is you'll have to have installed the experimental CRD. That's it. Like that's
it's effectively
feature
present
gate
but feature
equivalent. Yeah.
And we've even changed kind of the language around what experimental is in our GEP process. So like it doesn't guarantee anything sticks around. There's no guarantees of backwards compatibility or that it even lives on.
Yeah.
Sure. I just wanted to ask because I know when we were haggling over what it meant to build this, that we talked about a specification in client libraries and those sorts of things. And if it's an experimental, I don't care so much.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's already covered in graduation criteria. If it isn't, I think Flynn, you're taking notes. Do you mind adding a reminder for one of us to make sure it is covered in graduation criteria?
In this, for 1742, making sure that we talk about client implementations, client library.
Yeah, specifically for the duration formatting. Which I think this is basically a subset of existing formats, so it shouldn't be too hard. We just need to make sure it's
2257 already talks about some implementations, but I don't believe it does it explicitly as a graduation requirement. So we could
what I'd like to see for graduation is documentation, like end user facing documentation that says, as a tendril of our API, this is what is supported. You can certainly note that other implementations support this, but we should be careful that it's not bidirectional, that you can't take an arbitrary Go duration and produce a valid Kate's duration from it. Because it'll support things that we don't.
Yeah.
Yes, makes sense. Cool.
So just to be clear, the point of the client libraries there is for us to have a client library that we distribute as part of with the API version structs that gives you a validate function that we keep up to date in one place, such that everyone can use the same validation logic and people don't have to rewrite it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yep.
Even if it's just a contrib directory where you've got like a per language like implementation that people can cut and paste. I don't care if they can't even import it. Like I just want it to be codified in code, right?
The point of clarifying specifically in the GEP that we are not intending this to round trip with a time.duration is going to be important. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Cool, thanks. Sorry if I cut out every now and then. For some reason, my Wi-Fi is flaky, which at the office I would expect not to be the case, but here we are. So apologies in advance.
The whole thing runs on Google Wi-Fi.
Rob.
Yeah, I mean, of all the places to have flaky Wi-Fi, this is not what I would expect. But before I forget, I'm gonna go ahead and make Nick and Shane co-hosts. So if I disappear, feel free to take this one over and run with it. All right. Next up, backend TLS policy. This is meant to. This is a brand new policy, the first implementation of policy attachment built into Gateway API. It is intended to be a multi-tenant policy, and that we expect every implementation of Gateway API to also support this. at least once it gets out of experimental. Basically, it configures TLS validation for backends. So there's a few different fields here. 3 actually. I've only covered 2 of them because they're exclusive. But maybe I'll start with host name because that's kind of the glue of all of this. So you're targeting a service by default. The same could apply to other backend types, but this is focused on service right now. And you're saying, I expect that this one with host name, it's kind of a dual purpose field of I want the gateway to use this SNI when connecting to the backend. So foo.example.com, and I expect that the backend is going to serve a cert that matches that name. So again, foo.example.com. So it's a dual purpose thing. And then we've allowed by default 2 ways of configuring the CAs that you trust here. One is standard certs, and that says, hey, I'm going to trust the certs that are in the system. That's kind of implementation specific by definition. There's some prior art for this in Kubernetes, and I forget the other API that does this. Maybe it's, I forget. And then there's, in addition to this, there's a list of cert refs that you can provide instead that is just a way to say, I trust this CA, for example, this custom CA that I'm providing. So that's the gist of this policy. We have room to expand it, but this is really trying to be the minimum viable product that we can ship. And again, experimental only. I don't know if I made that more or less confusing as I was describing, but any questions or concerns on this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to get a little bit of clarification. So for front end TLS is going to be on the listener, but then the back end TLS is policy attachment, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Are there like any like ideas about whether or not the front end would also just eventually get turned into a policy?
Probably
kind
not.
of like
It
detached
needs to
from
be
the listener.
It needs to be included on the listener in the same way that the server details are. It's really important that it's done that way for reasons.
Yeah,
that I don't want to get into now because we don't have time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, don't hesitate to ping on Slack, or there's a link to Gap. Any way, yeah, but definitely have to follow up offline on that one.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be abrupt there, but like we really need to make sure we get through everything.
Is this the first thing other than HTTP ref using a target ref of a service? Sorry, HTTP route.
This is the first policy that's included in Gateway API at all. And so this is the first policy. Yes is the answer, because this is the first thing that uses a target ref at all. You know, that's actually included. Other people have used policy objects to do this, but yeah.
Yeah, it's I'm asking mostly because the GAP explicitly says service mesh use cases should ignore the design components described in this proposal, which is interesting.
The reason for this is that most service meshes have their own ways of handling this same use case, i.e. they have a dynamic method of provisioning this sort of stuff, and we specifically wanted to make this is for when your backend, your service is doing its own TLS, and there's no TLS magic, you know, that's handled by the application developer, and your backend expects a request to show up as TLS and TLS only. And so this is a way to say the gateway that is connecting to your backend needs to do TLS. And so this specific one only attaches to service, because we considered that the TLS config is closely tied to the application, and thus it is owned by the application developer persona.
Yeah, I'll time box this real quickly, but I do want to say that I have it on my to-do list. I want to come back to this gap because I think it is something that can apply to mesh. It is currently intentionally out of scope for mesh, but I think it can apply there. I don't want to open that can of worms here, but there will be a follow-up.
It's a big can of worms. We should talk about that.
Yeah.
Yes. Tim, from an API review point of view, do you have any thoughts?
Rob showed me this one before, so he's already addressed my concerns. So I get it. I don't have any expertise in this area to draw on. My first question that I think I can answer myself was, why is the host name not just a pass through of the front end? But I think I get why that would not be useful.
Yeah.
Otherwise, no, I think I understand this.
Yeah, and and in most cases, we're expecting some kind of internal host name. In some cases, it's going to be generated identity. It's going to vary a lot depending on the system, but often it will be different than what is being served on the listener on the gateway.
I think it's probably important to support just passing through the host name, but hey, this is an experimental API, and so we can come back and continue with that.
Yep. And right now
exactly.
you can pass through the thing, you just make the host name the same.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing here, this is attached to the service, so it could be targeted by 5 different gateways with 5 different listener host names, right? Like it can be disconnected.
And that will happen. Onward. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So very related to that last one, backend TLS policy is something that we are considering, our first policy implementation inside Gateway API itself. We've seen lots of vendors, lots of implementation specific policies. This is the first time we're testing the whole model out ourselves in Gateway API itself. And one of the things that has brought to light is we need a way to handle what I would call multi-tenant policies, but the idea that many implementations are going to be looking at the same policy and going to want to set status on it. And that is very similar to the problem we had with route. And so we're proposing changing it, solving it the same way we solved it with route. So hard to describe it via YAML because it's pretty verbose, but basically there is a list of policy ancestor status structs in policy status now, and each one of them includes a list to the ancestor reference, the controller name, and a set of conditions. So basically it would say you may have attached in this case, a backend TLS policy to a service, but maybe Gateway A supports that and Gateway B does not, for example. And both of them are implemented by the same controller, let's even say, or maybe they're not. But this allows you to set policy status per unique identifying ancestor. In many cases, that ancestor may be a gateway, but it's the thing that defines what really truly is that this policy is effective against, right? So there's going to be different stacks for the same service, for example.
So I think there's a couple of things to call out here. Firstly, the word ancestors. I chose that pretty deliberately because the intent here is that when you attach a policy to a service, the ancestors of that policy are in order: the service, the route, the gateway, and the gateway class. All of those are ancestors. And depending on exactly how the policy, because again, this doesn't only apply to backend TLS policy, but depending on how the policy works, a different ancestor may be the relevant ancestor in terms of namespacing the status for that policy. So the intent here is to make it so that we can represent those things. For backend TLS policy, the most likely relevant ancestor is the gateway. And so that's the point of doing this. That's the point of using the word ancestor, is that there's some flexibility for the struct. But the other thing that's really important is that it's intended that this list of policy ancestor statuses that's in the status of a policy object is effectively a list type map where the key is the combination of the ancestor ref and controller name. So importantly, that allows you to have the same controller with different status for different ancestors, or different controllers have status for the same ancestor. So if your service is only bound to a route that's bound to a single gateway, but you have multiple controllers reconciling that gateway, which actually is not possible, but sorry, but But in any case, like the idea here is to make it so that both of those things are possible and work, and namespacing works.
Cool. Any questions on this one? I'll take it.
Yeah, hold on.
Okay.
Can you speak to the cardinality of this?
Yeah, it is a
This feels
worry.
an awful lot like something that's going to be bringing up many of the same fan out fighting with the API types of issues that we have discussed at great length with policy attachment. And it's kind of disconcerting to me to see this additional complexity tossed in, which, yeah.
It's so, yeah, I agree. The intent by having the ancestor ref is to sort of minimize the so TLS backend policy is an interesting case because it attaches to the service, it is likely, very likely, that multiple controllers will need to reconcile it. So that status needs to be namespaced by at least controller. Because of the way that services attach to objects that attach to objects that attach to objects, it's also likely that there's going to be one service may be used in multiple like gateways, essentially. And so the intent here is to provide a way to represent that while keeping the cardinality to a minimum by allowing you to specify the gateway rather than the route as the relevant ancestor. Because most likely, if the service is allowed on one route in a gateway, it'll probably be allowed on all routes in the gateway because the implementation can do it.
Is there any, like, what happens when I've got some bizarro case where I end up with 1,000 of these?
There is a limit on there's a limit on the status current on the structs currently that's like low, like 8 or something like that. And so, and the additional ones will fall off. It's not ideal, but it stops us hitting the maximum record size limit.
What does that mean? They'll fall off? The client will know to elide them, or the server will reject them, or
server will reject them because the server will reject them because there's more than 8 entries in that.
So they won't fall off. You'll just end up with a client in a hot loop trying to.
Yes, which is also bad. I know. I don't have a good solution for those things yet, which is why I wanted to have people try this out and see what happens. That's why it's in experimental. I anticipate that any problems that come up, we will just need to deal with as part of the experimental process. But I feel like spending too much time optimizing the design here feels like time that could very easily be wasted when like it could turn out that people use it in a different way than I thought, or that controllers work a different way than I thought, or something like that. I'd rather get this into people's hands and let them try it out. Again, with the assumption here that this one is very experimental. Like the whole object is in experimental, and this pattern is also experimental on top of that.
Triple experimental.
Yeah, exactly. Super ultra double secret probation experimental.
That's right.
Nick,
okay,
I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna lie. I personally have a really hard time thinking that this is far enough along to include in a GA release, even if we call it experimental, because I don't think we have a sufficiently vocal way to call something out as, hey, this is not GA, even if the rest of the API is.
The resource is alpha.
Yeah, I think to be clear here, and this is a thing we'll struggle with, but we are doing our best, is v1.0 represents that gateway class, and HTTP route are sufficiently stable that we think that we can call them GA. With that said, this is referring to policy attachment, which is still experimental. And it's only being introduced in backend TLS policy, which is a brand new, very experimental resource that I think we can avoid any kind of connotations of stability. I can kind of see your point if we're trying to attach a concept to gateway directly or something that's very stable, but in this case, this is attaching an experimental concept to another experimental concept, and I think combined they're okay.
I think what, if I'm not mistaken, what's being said is experimental often gets thought of as beta. And even though we've changed some of our semantics, if enough momentum gets behind this, we'll end up in a situation where we may not be able to solve some of the problems we've set up for ourselves. I think that's what Flynn was trying to get at. Like, the path
Yep.
forward seems really unclear, but people will still think of this as beta because it's
Yeah.
in a GA release as experimental. Like,
I
it's
mean-
not beta. We could remove it, but the momentum may carry it forward into a worse state than this. That's the concern. And I think I understand that concern.
I get it, and I have written my thoughts on how Kubernetes manages alpha and beta, and they're not complementary. But
How very politic of you to put it that way, Tim.
I mean, I made half the mess, so it's okay, right? We ship alpha APIs every single release, and we have rarely, but not zero times, ripped them away or changed them in dramatic ways. So I don't feel too bad if somebody uses something that says alpha and then they get upset with you when you change it or take it away, right? I mean, Rob, you've seen how those conversations go. I'm okay with that. I don't have too much sympathy.
Well, we have seen a counterexample with Gateway API where policy attachment itself was experimental and people still decided to rely on it. So
Yeah, I think
and I'm a little, that makes me a little bit gun shy in this particular area. Let me be clear about that. So this is, Nick and Rob and I have had lots of discussions on this particular topic, but yeah, this one feels worrisome, guys. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm
I
not
see what
really
you're
sorry.
saying, and
I just
I think what you're describing is the difference between a resource, and I know that you're not calling out this as being concerning, when it by definition includes this policy status change. But as I understand it, you're not as concerned about this because it is a resource that clearly has alpha label, whatever. Whereas what we're describing here is a pattern that other implementations may pick up and use. And it's hard to predict how, we can label that experimental all day long,
yeah.
and people may still pick it up and run
It's
with
also
it.
much more straightforward to me to imagine how to implement something that makes use of backend TLS stuff. And it's considerably more difficult for me to think through all of the ways in which this ancestor stuff could cause weird problems, like, the client looping forever, hunting for something that it's never, because there were 9 of them, or, something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do want to time box this one, but
Yeah.
maybe what we should, I think your concern here is that we need to, I think this is a hard requirement for backend TLS policy. And so I think we need to at least find a way to get it in for backend TLS policy. Maybe that can be the mode we experiment with it. But I get what you're saying, that we need to be careful with what we do in GEP 713 because there are people building on top of it. And we just need to be very careful.
Why is the status for this on the policy and not on the referent in the first place?
Because there's no way to put it on the referent.
Why, like, if it's a problem with the gateway that isn't accepting it, why not put it on the gateway?
So we can, but then we have a similar problem in that we need a way to tell people which service attached to which route is the relevant one that has the problem on the gateway, when the gateway could have a large number of possible services. And I wanted to avoid having to include a JSON path or equivalent inside the status. I want to be able to use the upstream condition status as the struct here, rather than having to have a special type of condition that has that has like a JSON path or something like that in it. Contra, and it didn't work.
as a very concrete example, I can take one implementation I'm familiar with, GKE, right? We have many classes of load balancers available. Some of them are legacy. Some probably won't be able to support backend TLS policy, right? So you're going to have the same controller with two gateways, one legacy, one new, looking at the same service. And in that case, you need to be able to communicate at that point, like this gate, it works for this gateway and it doesn't for that gateway. And you want that communication to be as close to either the backend TLS policy or the service it's targeting as possible, I think. And it could also be helpful to have that, to surface that at the gateway level. But that is, you know, I don't think that's good enough. I think you need to have some kind of awareness at this level, at this configuration level, that something is not working as intended.
Okay,
Yeah, I think
we don't need to do it here. I mean, if I was a user, naively, I would expect to say, why am I not getting TLS on my service? What's going on with my gateway? kubectl describe gateway. What the hell? Why is it not working? I wouldn't think to look at the policy for status. Policy is like a document resource, not an active resource in my brain.
okay. So
I completely agree with that.
okay, so one of the reasons I'm doing this is the extensive discussion that we had previously about how policy was hard to find, and that the reason that we wanted to do this was to make it so that the object you create holds the status for that object represents. And so that's why the policy is on the status and not on the gateway, because otherwise you could equally say, hey, I created a backend TLS policy, but now I got to go and look at the gateway to find out if it worked or not.
Yeah.
And so and so that's what I have erred here on the side of, the thing that gets created to, like, the intent here is that the persona that is creating the backend TLS policy is the application owner. The person who owns the service is the person who creates the backend TLS policy. And so that person should be able to look at the object that they created to see if it's being used correctly by some gateways somewhere. And so like it's the reason that we've done it this way is to center the persona that owns the object in the information about how well the object is working. I don't disagree that it would be useful to have a breadcrumb back from the gateway pointing to say, hey, like one or more services here are not working because they're backend I don't support backend TLS policy. Yep, I agree, that's probably a good call out, but I think it's really important to have the backend TLS policy itself be reflective. It's not just a document thing, because sometimes the policy is going to work. It's going to be different on different policies. Sometimes it will be just thing, but a lot of the time it's going to be whoever creates the policy needs to know on that policy whether or not the policy is taking effect. Flynn literally wrote a whole story about how wrong that could go. And this is what I've hoped to fix that.
I've been sitting here thinking about, okay, so why am I not instantly going, oh yeah, Nick is totally right about this. And I apologize for not being able to articulate that right now. So I'm going to think about that, and I'm going to try very hard to figure out what it is.
Yeah, I think that's,
yeah, let me put some effort into that, Nick. And
that's fine. I will let it percolate. Nick, I hear what you're saying. It feels different from a lot of other things that we do, which is always sort of a concern. But I hear and I acknowledge that a lot of thought has been put into this. This isn't haphazard. So let's push ahead.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, we got three more things. So we'll keep on running through them. They do get smaller. One, we're adding a new concept called Gateway. I forget what it's actually called, but it's GEP 1709. I've just called it Gateway labels, but the idea that you can specify labels or annotations on a gateway, and they will be propagated down to the resources that are provisioned for a gateway. I think the most straightforward example of this is you want to say everything associated with this should have a label, app bar, and prod, whatever. You can imagine that this, wherever possible, could also apply to non-Kubernetes resources if those are what are being created. But again, just the idea that I want to group all these like things together with a shared set of labels or annotations. Also experimental. Yeah.
So for non-cube things, this is an assertion of, if you have a metadata system, please somehow indicate this.
Yeah.
Yes, and it can also be used, it is important to call out, for cube things, for all of the in-cluster implementations that generate a load balancer service that need to be able to set annotations on that load balancer service to set the type of load balancer service or whatever. You can do that with this as well. I know that we have talked before in the past about how that is in many ways better to describe as part of a gateway class, but we've got a lot of pushback from many implementations that users do not want to have a lot of gateway classes because they don't like having cluster resources. People want to have 0 gateway classes, in fact. And so I don't want to open that discussion here, but this is the best, the point that I'm trying to make is that this is the best approximation we can get that lets people do something without leaning too hard into it. We've specifically only added this at gateway, so there's no confusion about multiple levels or things overriding or anything like that. Yeah, this is as brutally simple as we could make it and still have some and still solve the problem for some people.
Is there no risk of colliding with labels defined elsewhere? Like, if this comes and manifests as a software load balancer that is running somewhere, that load balancer itself has got labels that were decided by the implementation, like there's a risk of collision, even if it's a very small risk. Do we have a clear statement on like, don't do that?
No, not currently.
I thought the spec defined that the implementation, any implementation owned labels would take precedent over. But
I think
another follow-up that would be good to have in the notes, just so we don't lose it. But I thought that was addressed.
Something like that seems reasonable. I don't even care which way it goes. Just a statement.
We just need to have guidance one way or another. I agree, so that they will pick one way.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. The next one is called backend protocol selection, but from I don't know if Dave's on the call, but Dave has been pushing this forward in both upstream Kubernetes and in Gateway API. But basically, he had pushed forward along with a couple other people, adding new app protocols for HTTP2 and WebSocket in upstream Kubernetes. And that helps enable app protocol to make more sense for Gateway API, and specifically a way that you can opt into WebSocket support on implementations that don't have it enabled by default. So there's a whole gap that describes how this interacts. I think it's fairly straightforward. There's a small snippet that's added to API spec for backend ref, I think, that's related to this. Yeah, but that's all in this one. And yeah, okay. I'll real quickly just cover, there's a lot more that's happening in parallel with this. Ingress to Gateway is finally getting ready to release this month. Huge thanks to everyone who's been working on that. Lior, Kobe, others have been really driving that forward. We have 2 different, so in addition to plain Ingress resources, we also have Ingress Nginx annotations, and I think Kong supported as, implementation specific conversion as well that's supported here. And then we're also building Gateway Cuddle, which we're hoping will provide a much better kubectl experience for Gateway. It shows attached, available, and effective policies. So it does a lot to compute, policy attachment, what's attached here, what's available in your cluster.
2 questions. Is that designed to be a standalone tool or a kubectl plugin?
Either can work, but yes, it should work as a kubectl plugin.
Okay. And 2, can we just say that cuddle is the official pronunciation and be done with it?
No,
I'm on board.
No. Come on, dude. That's crazy talk. It's control. Everybody knows that.
I eventually switched sides. I used to be team control, but I've given up. It's cuddle all the way. Yeah, so I'm excited about all this additional work. This is just to say there's a lot of momentum here. You know, one of the big gotchas in when you're working with CRDs is there's no way to customize the output of describe. And so one of the things coming with Gateway Cuddle is Gateway Cuddle Describe, which will show you things like attached policies, effective policy, etc. Right inside instead of the rather frustrating output you get by default of CRDs.
As a kubectl plugin, would it be kubectl Gateway or kubectl GW Cuddle?
GW.
Kubectl
Okay,
GW
so
describe.
yeah, so I think what it will be is kubectl GW describe and then resource. So it can get a little funny if you do kubectl GW describe GW, but that's, you know, unfortunate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, any last comments or questions? I know we're at time here.
I saw
I'm
something
frankly
about,
amazed we got through everything. That was awesome. Sorry,
Yeah,
Hamza, I didn't mean to step on you.
sorry, I saw something about CEL validation. Not sure we ever
Yeah.
got into that.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah, we did
skipped
skip
through
that,
that. This is something that we covered in 0.8 review as
0.80.
well. But yes, cell validation is for real. In 1.0, webhook installation is optional, and we are moving away. But webhook will still be supported because we support the 5 trailing releases of Kubernetes, and 123 and 124 don't fully support cell yet.
So you got to
So
100% coverage of validation through cell?
it's 99%. I've gotten some feedback that we're doing things that are like really pushing the limits of cell, which I would agree with. But it technically fits. So
What's
There
the
is
web.
one thing about there's one thing about case that Cell cannot do at the moment that we have
Yeah.
feature requests in to make it do.
Which
It's
I'm
pretty-
totally cool with. I'm fine with. You said 99%, Rob. Does that mean there's 1% that we went, we don't need to validate that?
Yeah, so in 0.8, we added guidance that said implementations need to handle this case and add something to status, basically. So it's instead of the immediate validation that we had with webhook, it's going back to status, but it's such an edge case that I think it's unlikely to actually occur and certainly not worth leaving a webhook around for. So
Which means
was
nobody will
something
test
like-
for it. So when it does happen, it explodes.
I
No, I'm kidding.
yeah.
It's fine. Look, no secret, I'm a big fan of moving things to declarative validation. So I appreciate you guys paying the pioneer tax yet again, and beating your heads on the very sharp rock that is Cell right now. That said, the Cell team really wants feedback. Rob has been participating in that too. So we are going to push really hard that we can make it more readable, more maintainable. Multi-line expressions and those sorts of things seem like they're pretty much required.
Yep. Cool.
Multiple
Well, thank you.
expressions will make that so much nicer all by itself.
Yeah. Yes.
And then, so 1.9 will only support 1.25 and above.
No, so to clarify, 125 and above have fully built-in cell support. If you're installing below that, we recommend still including the webhook, but it's a standalone installation instead of being bundled with everything else starting on 1.0. So
between 25 and 28, were there no changes to the cell library that you need?
Yeah, everything we're doing is based on like the minimum viable, which is 125 plus. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Cool.
there's changes we want, but not changes we need.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we will pick up those changes as as our support window, which is 5 Kubernetes releases, sort of moves along. We will
It'll be
pick up cell changes as like basically 5. We'll have to run 5 behind.
It'll be very sad because I know that we're working on great things, but it's going to be a long time till we can pick them up. But yeah, whatever. With that said, I know
a year and a half between friends.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the great feedback here. We are hoping to get a release candidate out ASAP. This is, of course, we are targeting a end of October release for 1.0. So yes, we are hoping to move quickly here. Thank you so much to everyone for the conversation on this call, and we'll follow up offline.
Thanks,
So everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
See y'all.